Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kit. I'm Vice President of AIM. Happy holidays. We're really excited to do this kind of virtual lunch and learn presentation of our latest research with you today. So this virtual event was an idea that was brought into us by our ERG virtual network, our employee resource group network that puts on various virtuals and in-person events throughout the year. This group has been headed up by our board member, York Lowe, and several other people who comprise the committee, including people from Oak Tree Capital and Wellington, State Street, several of others. And so thank you so much to those folks on that advisory committee who have really helped us form this group. So the primary mission of this group is to gather throughout the year and establish best practices and collaborate on resources for various affinity groups throughout the industry. But we do things like, gather research and data, which we'll talk about today, various forms of professional development, and collaborate on those things throughout the year. It's an honor today to have our research team member, Alex Bilius from Bella Private Markets, to share our latest data with you on our study that we presented recently at the conference. And so at this point, I'll just pass it off to our CEO, Jim, and then we'll do a presentation followed by a fireside chat and some Q&A.
Terrific. Thank you, Kit. Welcome, everyone, and we're excited to make this our last event of the year. We had quite a year this year at AIM. For those of you who attended our national conference, you saw kind of the dynamic nature of the event that we hosted. But we've also had almost 20 events throughout the country, chapter events, events focused on venture capital, emerging managers, and other things that we have supported throughout the year. And we're just excited and blessed, frankly, to be able to wrap up the year with this conversation. One of the things that we've always tried to do as an organization is to not rely on anecdotes to tell our story, but to really discuss what's happening in the marketplace with real data, real research. And I am so excited that Alex Bilius, who's also a part of the team, with Josh Lerner, who is, as many of you know, is widely recognized as one of the leaders. And Alex actually does all the work. So, Josh gets all the credit. And we're taping this, but don't show it to Josh, please, Alex. But Alex and his team does an amazing work in terms of creating content, research, information that is really reshaping how we talk about DEI in the marketplace. Alex is the Chief Operating Officer at Private Markets Consulting and advisory firm, Bella Private Markets. He also leads Bella's efforts in developing quantitative tools, including portfolio cash simulation and performance benchmark softwares. At Bella, Bella is widely recognized as one of the thought leaders in this industry. And so I'm very excited to have Alex provide an overview of some of the research findings. We put out 2 separate research this year along with Alex and his team. One focused on the attrition, kind of career growth and some of the challenges facing Asian Americans. But also we did a separate study focused on Asian American owned firms. As you know, ownership, and we'll get a chance to talk to Mark Ricotta, who is really a thought leader, but also a business leader in our community, about the importance of ownership, AUM, and being able to create generational wealth. But we did those 2 separate studies. And Alex, I know you're going to kind of go through some of the high-level findings. We encourage you to send some questions if you like, if you want clarifications. But this is the issue that we're fighting for, to ensure that we as a community, Asian American Pacific Islanders as a community, have full representation in the investment business, whether you're working for a firm or whether you're out there building your own business as an entrepreneur. So with that, Alex, take it away.
Thanks, Jim. Much appreciated. I definitely won't tell Josh what you said, but that's okay. We've been fortunate enough, like Jim mentioned, to be able to work with AIM on this research, which we view as obviously critically important in this space. I think a lot of really the issues kind of start with not being able to track them or quantify them in the first place. And so really appreciate kind of AIM taking the initiative to take that first step and really kind of put some numbers around the problem. So like Jim mentioned, we worked on this project originally in 2020, and we just did a recent update, particularly given that diversity in general, not just in finance, is an issue that's really come to the forefront over the last few years. Finance in particular, we see such low representation for historically underrepresented groups. So whether it's headlines in top articles or blogs or wherever else, I mean, you see this as a persistent issue and something that rightfully people are talking about. Especially given that from the research that is out there on this issue, there are lots of benefits to increasing diversity within firms, both at the management level, but even below that. So for instance, we see in looking at venture capital, for instance, so you have a more diverse mix of partners, we see better performance. We see more positive outcomes when it comes to looking at exits for startup companies. If we also look at sort of socio-demographic diversity in terms of mix of backgrounds, not just ethnic or racial characteristics, we see also higher returns there. So this idea of diversity of thought is truly beneficial. And this is something that some researchers have been able to quantify. On the flip side, we also see that there may be downsides to not introducing diversity in addition to positive benefits, right? So if we look at, for instance, in the case of VC, we see male founders, who male VCs tend to favor investing with male founders. And in a lot of cases, when they looked into this issue, they find that that sort of preference for investing with people who may be familiar to you in some ways on a sort of superficial basis results in underperformance. So female entrepreneurs that they may have passed on ultimately ended up underperforming. And so there are all these reasons to think that diversity is positive and really generates true financial benefits. Fortunately, we still see challenges remain. Despite all these things, we're just not seeing that level of representation that you might expect given the benefits. And so I've looked into possible explanations for why that must be. So for instance, some recent research has looked at why there's less capital going to female managers, in this case in the mutual fund industry. And when the authors went back and looked into it, find that it's unconscious gender bias in a lot of cases that's affecting the investment decisions that are ultimately being made. And sort of this ultimately comes back to this issue of what researchers have called homophily, or the idea that you invest with people who in some ways are similar to you, whether in terms of appearance or background or other factors. As a result, what you see is this wealth ends up being concentrated in generally non-diverse groups, given that that's sort of where historically the money is been. And so it's been hard to break through that issue just given something like homophily, which tends to persist. It can also be used as a positive. So more recent research from Josh and some of his colleagues have found that on the flip side, when you have minority-owned private capital funds and firms, they're more likely to fund minority entrepreneurs. And so it is really this double-edged sword where this is something that ultimately might be a positive tool if it's harnessed in the right way. At the end of the day, I mean, all this suggests ultimately there are implicit biases that really do remain a challenge in finance, just typically historically been a conservative industry and one that's somewhat slow to change anyway. So these issues have just sort of compounded over time. So like I mentioned at the start, part of the issue is really just putting some numbers around it. And really what that comes down to is there's just a lack of data. And so it's not necessarily difficult to count how many firms there may be out there if you knew what firms were out there. The problem is no one's really tracking this information. And so in a lot of cases, the studies that have existed have tended to look more at public markets where data is a little bit more available. And it's also looked at traditional definitions of gender, just given that for a lot of research methods, it's easier to identify people on that basis. There have been some efforts to maybe standardize this. For instance, the Institutional Limited Partners Association, ILPA, they'll put out a lot of guidance for private markets, but it's not something that really we see being picked up more broadly across the industry. And there's really just this lack of systematization, not just in terms of what to do with the data once you have it, but even how to track it, how to define it. And so it's really tough to sort of conduct these broad studies that might help quantify the issue in the first place. So recognizing this, AIM really took the initiative to try to do a first rigorous look at this issue, particular focus on Asian American Pacific Islander AAPI representation in finance. And so rather than in the past, a lot of the work has almost been more of an advocacy piece. This was really an effort to get the facts, to get the data that we could, and to really establish a baseline for what's there. This sort of quantitative basis is really useful because then you can start to build on what we actually know to be there as opposed to speculating. And so we originally did this report in 2020. What we did is we looked at representation at the ownership level across firms. And this was really as a result of the data that is available. We'll talk a little bit about the data that we actually used and what's out there. But most recently, we updated not only that study, but we extended it. What we did as well is looked at the representation of AAPI women. And then even beyond that, maybe more relevant here is looking at the talent pipeline, something that hadn't ever been done before, looking at sort of progression in finance, what representation looks like at each sort of level of seniority. And so by putting numbers around all these issues, it's a really important way to establish that baseline and then figure out where do we go from here. And fortunately, it seems to have drawn some positive attention. We're really highlighting the issues, and it's great to see that these studies have been picked up sort of by mainstream press. So we see headlines here. I think a part of the narrative has been not just quantifying it, though. We've realized that when looking at the actual numbers and then comparing them to these DEI initiatives that may be out there, sort of see a differential application of those initiatives to AAPIs relative to other groups. There may have been this notion that AAPIs are in some ways overrepresented in finance relative to other groups. When we really actually look into the numbers, we see that that's not necessarily the case. And so by quantifying it, it's a helpful way to push back against that narrative and sort of establish what the actual baseline is to then hopefully start moving forward with some real progress in terms of these initiatives. So how do we do this thing? So we used a variety of different databases. Some of you may be familiar with these different sources, but these are all commercial providers. They're used widely in research. So for private equity, real estate, and venture capital firms, when we looked at that segment of finance, we used the database Preqin. They collect information on funds, performance, but ultimately it allows us to look at whether firms are minority owned or not. And in those cases, then be able to break it down further and say, is it owned by Black majority owned or is it Hispanic majority owned, and so forth. For hedge funds, we use a hedge fund research database, very comprehensive data set covering the hedge fund industry. And then for mutual funds, for public equity, we used eVestment. And so by using these commercial databases, looking at the US specifically, that's how we were able to quantify everything at the ownership level at the top. And those are important summary statistics for establishing a baseline. But for this latest analysis, where we need to go down a level, we want to look at the pipeline, not just everyone at the top, but what it takes to get there and what it looks like along the way. This is a data set that just doesn't exist off the shelf. And so this is really one of the more exciting parts of this analysis. And it was great to see AIM interested in doing this, because what we were able to do is take a sample across 100 largest firms in each of these 4 asset classes. And by looking at these 400 firms, we scraped by hand and using a bunch of algorithms, a bunch of different researchers to compile ultimately a database of over 20,000 people by different seniority across firms, across asset classes. And by able to study that data set, we were able to come up with insights that really haven't existed before. And we'll share some of those as we get a little further into this. So first, starting at the ownership level, what do we find? Fortunately, representation on the whole, especially as a percentage of the whole industry, is quite low. We see in some cases, for instance, venture capital tends to be maybe a little bit of a brighter spot in terms of representation. But beyond that, if we look at either the absolute numbers in terms of number of firms, funds, or AUM, relatively speaking, those numbers are quite low, especially if you just compare to the overall population. The same is true among AIP women as well. So as a percentage of all women owners, so not just the whole population, this is of just women owners, we see similarly low percentages. So if you think about, relatively speaking, how low representation is for females to begin with, taking then such a small percentage of that number, ultimately we see something on the order of 0.1% ownership for female AAPI-owned firms. So unfortunately, really low numbers here. We weren't even able to calculate some analyses for certain asset classes, just given the low representation. And all of this, despite the fact, similar to even findings we saw in the beginning when we did a similar analysis looking at the performance of these groups, we see outperformance. I mean, there are clear benefits to having, in this case, what we're looking at is AAPI-owned funds compared to non-AAPI-owned funds. And we do see some statistically significant differences in performance when it comes to private equity, venture capital, hedge funds. We look at mutual funds, there's really no difference, whether that's a function of those markets just being more efficient generally, or harder to beat the mean. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the point is there is no difference in performance from what we see here. And so trying to make the argument that the reason that these programs may not be getting funding or these managers may not be getting capital is due to low performance or underperformance, which is a narrative we heard historically, it just doesn't hold water when we look at the actual numbers. So we take a step back, sort of at the high level, at the ownership level, we see low representation despite high performance. When we start looking below that though, what does it take to even get there in the first place? This is really, we looked at this career ladder analysis. And so by hand gathering that data set of over 20,000 individuals across 100 firms within each class, what we did is we took that group and based on their titles, their backgrounds, it describes, to sort of make it apples to apples across firms and asset classes, we bucketed them into seniority tiers. So at the top end, the sort of tier 1 employees, to be the most senior people, it's like your partners, your managing directors, along that sort of level. Below that, we have tier 2, so second most junior, sort of right on that cusp. This is more principal level, VP level, depending on the industry you're looking at. Below that, we see tier 3, the sort of associate level, and then below that as well, we see ultimately the sort of entry-level analyst type of group, so tier 4. And so when we do this, what do we see? Ultimately, maybe unfortunately, not surprisingly, we see attrition as we go through sort of lowest level of seniority up to the top. So by the time you move from an entry level all the way to the most senior level, we see almost a 50% drop in sort of representation across these asset classes. Ultimately, it's below 10% the top level, the most senior employees. If we look within asset classes, same general story seems to hold, where in general, we see a sharp drop off. There are some differences across asset classes. So we do see, for instance, in PE, that representation tends to be the highest. This is consistent with actually some of the ownership data we saw before. PE here also includes venture capital, which tended to have the highest representation. So this may be a case of PE and venture tending to have a little bit higher representation overall. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we still see that significant drop off by the time you get to the most senior levels of employment. We do see some interesting patterns in the data here, whether it's a question of how different asset classes think about seniority in their titles. It's a little bit unclear, might warrant further research. Another question that might be interesting to look into in future research is not just what representation looks like at each tier, sort of how long it takes to move through that progression. There may be some additional insights we can see about not only overall representation and who makes it to which level, but how long it takes, what it takes to get there, to see if there are any sorts of differences. So if we then look at a similar study, but just focusing on just females again, so this is within just the pool of females, we see a similar drop in representation, generally speaking, across the tiers. So while AAPI women, as a percentage of all women, show slightly higher representation than AAPIs on the whole, we still see a significant drop moving again from that entry level through the most senior tiers. And similar story again across asset classes, where starts off typically higher and tends to drop. Do you see some interesting patterns here where there may be higher representation as you move up prior to a point? So we see, for instance, an increase in PE, even in hedge funds through some of the tiers before you get to the most senior. This may be evidence of sort of hitting a ceiling that some people have talked about being a particular problem here of only being able to make it so far without progressing forwards. Something like that is an interesting question that definitely warrants further research. So ultimately, what do we take away? It's clearly a big problem. It's persistent as well. We've seen some progress over time, but these initial statistics really help quantify it in the first place. And what to do about this, I think ultimately, to the extent that you can create a sort of accessible database, it'd go a long way towards helping with this issue. The databases that do exist for this, some of the commercial providers, it's a lot of times really unclear how they source, prepare that data, work with it. It can also have impact significantly on results from analyses like these, just given there are so few data to start with. So to the extent the methodologies change or the samples change, you have an outside impact on the overall story. So having a greater understanding of what's going into the data and having it be open source would be a tremendous resource. The second is really just this idea of increasing the talent pipeline from the start. So like we saw with the progression analysis, there's some representation to the start that does tend to fall off. To the extent you can keep building the pipeline, it seems like there's a case to be made for that ultimately helping down the road with this issue. We can see even just looking towards, for instance, there was a study that showed that when you had more female politicians in a given region, diverse female entrepreneurial activity tends to increase following the election of those politicians. This idea of homophily, again, being potentially a source for good. To the extent you increase representation, may sort of have this positive feedback effect where you can start to build the pipeline as it gets more visibility. So all this to say, ultimately, it's not a problem that's going to solve itself overnight. But to the extent we can keep shedding light on it through studies like this, the work that AAIM's doing, all the promotion of this sort of research is ultimately, I think, the best way forward for this. So to the extent we can keep tracking, reporting this sort of information, I think all the better for the industry moving forward.
Looking at the attrition level or how we progress as a community, I know you and your team actually went in and personally almost hand counted all those folks to see how people kind of progressed. So there was a combination of both what was already readily available. Some of it was all unique to what you've done. So any other kind of I think it does point to the fact that the inconsistent reporting has been a challenge for this industry. But one thing that you and Josh and the Bella team have done several years ago, you talked about the AUM number, which I think shocked everyone. If you look at all women-owned firms, and if you look at all minority-owned firms combined, I think in a number of years back, a couple of years back, it was 1.4% AUM. So of all the dollars being managed in the marketplace, that number actually went up a little bit 2 years later, right, in 2022 to 1.7. But the Asian American Pacific Islander number actually went down. So it went up for everyone else. It went down for the Asian American community. Why do you think that is? What? And I'm going to ask Mark, and I'll do a more proper introduction to Mark, and we'll do a separate fireside. But why do you think that is? Why is it that the Asian community in this sort of in light of all of this sort of social justice discussion, more focus on DEI, why is it that our numbers are moving backwards in some ways?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's an important topic to hit on. On the one hand, you may be able to look at this and say, over the last few years, what have we seen happen? Particularly summer of 2020 drew a lot of attention to these sorts of social justice issues, as you say. And so I do think if you looked at sort of the overall funding levels to minority groups, you do see an increase. But as you say, the Asian community maybe hasn't increased at the same rate. So I do think there may be a sort of denominator effect at play here. And if you were to look at the absolute numbers of AUMs, I do think you see a slight increase. Again, it's on a proportional basis. It's just not increasing at the same rate as the other groups. And so I think this may play into a little bit the story of sort of the differential application of definitions of DEI and where those initiatives should be targeted. So all the more reason to really make the case for Asian Americans being underrepresented, particularly in the space. I think the more maybe technical part of the answer, and also feeds into this narrative of the data, is because it's not collected systematically and transparently, even by the providers, small changes in the underlying data, the methodologies can really have outsized impacts. So for instance, I think this last time around, we saw a drop in particular in some of the asset classes, real estate in particular, I think. And when we looked back, it was due to one particularly large group dropping out of the sample because they increased their ownership to be non-diverse owned in that case. And so when we see that ultimately it's so sensitive to these small changes in the data, by not capturing maybe some of the other smaller groups that may be out there and who aren't making their way into these sorts of studies, it's also sort of a function of ultimately this data issue. And so to the extent that can push more transparent, systematic reporting, I think that also might go a long way towards helping with this issue overall, and maybe see those numbers hopefully start trending in the right direction again.
I do want to bring Mark Okada into this conversation. I just want to do a quick introduction of Mark, and maybe Mark could have some thoughts on the research finding. And Mark is the chief executive. By the way, if he looks familiar, sometimes you'll see him on CNBC and on TV quite a bit about opining on what's happening with the interest rate and everything else. You were just recently on just a few days ago, and you had kind of a contrarian view about where the market, the interest rate kind of climate's headed in 24. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Mark. He's a chief executive officer of Sycamore Tree Capital Partners. Okada is one of the loan industry's most experienced and recognized investor and innovators, with over 30 years experience developing markets and products for investors around the world. He's regularly a commentator on CNBC, and he's widely recognized as really a thought leader in this business, and really a kind of a trailblazer in many ways as well. So, and when we started at AIM a few years back, when we started to look at efforts to create more data, more research, and thought leadership, Mark and his firm was one of the first to say, yes, I'll back you, I'll support the efforts that you're pursuing to kind of like really enlighten in the industry and maybe hopefully have an impact on the business that we're in overall. So Mark, you saw the extensive presentation by Alex and some of the numbers he kind of put out there. What resonates with you within that, and what's some of the things that concerns you in terms of the number that you see?
Without data, nothing can change or will change. We live in a very, very competitive environment of gatekeepers that control the flow of funds through the system. And the system is designed to get what the system gets. So to change that process, it takes something like this. So Alex, congratulations to you on doing this. And I think as we engage with you, Jim, in your fine work at AIM, I think the conversation we had is, how do we go from speeches to reaches? How do we get past this place where we're talking about stories or having a nice conference, to making a difference within the industry in the right way? And so research is obviously critical. I think one of the things that jumps out at me, though, Alex, from your research, is that I take a different bent on the attrition numbers. First of all, the numbers of entry level are very high, and we are clearly overrepresented in the industry. And then when you, even with attrition, when you get to the top, let's say it's 10% or whatever the numbers are, versus 6% of the population, I would say we're still overrepresented in senior people. And so I think my question would be, given that situation where you have a significant amount of API senior people in the industry, how are we engaging that cohort with data like this? Because if you put data that is powerful and positive in the right hands, and then I think we can have chances for more reaches versus speeches.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, when I look at those numbers as well, as you say, I guess as a proportion of kind of all entry levels, there is certainly something to be said for that level of overrepresentation. I think ultimately, though, the story would still seem to be the drop off, at least in my mind, where in a perfect world, you may want to see something more consistent across. And so there may be a story here about the base being built, the pipeline sort of being increased. And I think that's a positive thing one way or the other. I think it's more just the idea that attrition exists in the first place that may be part of the problem. And also part of this overall narrative of the sort of differential application of what DEI means for certain groups relative to others.
You've been at this for a long time, Mark. I mean, have you,
Sure.
30 years, you've seen, I mean, we've seen some progress as an industry, and you've seen kind of positive change. What's been noticeable change in your view? And, you know, and what are stuff that you think we still need to kind of focus on?
Well, I think where we're waking up to, as far as the AAPI community, as far as this issue, is that just doing a good job is not going to be enough. And, you know, keeping your head down and doing your work and not being, you know, sticking out in any way, which tends to be cultural, right? And it's certainly something that I wouldn't sit here and say that that's a bad thing. I think it's actually a very good thing. On the other hand, what needs to change is advocacy in my mind. There needs to be meaningful advocacy, because I don't see this as a bottoms-up problem. I really don't. I think you're hit it very the nail on the head about the quality of the pipeline here is excellent, and the work product is excellent. The outcomes are excellent. I mean, the performance numbers are meaningful and statistically important. So it you know, we can sit here all day and say, hey, you know, Asians need to start you know, advocating for themselves a little bit better. But I would put it on the asset owners and the allocators to be much more involved in doing that. And I've taken that to heart myself. I mean, in addition to funding studies like this, our firm is overrepresented as far as being diverse, and we're very focused on making sure that any of the cultural aspects that may hold someone back are discounted in that way and seen as what they are. And I would say that until asset owners come to the place where this type of diversity is seen as an asset as opposed to something they need to do, it really doesn't. It's not going to get anywhere, because, you know, Alex, your physics background, water will flow to where it's supposed to flow, and capital flows where it's best treated. That's kind of the axiom that I've lived by, and so I think from our standpoint, we see this as a true value to the benefit and creating alpha within our company. You know, this is my second startup, but I grew the first one to 40 billion, and this next one is a couple billion now, and we're doing well. But that diversity of thought, the diversity of opinions, and the culture that it respects that and sees that as value, has really added a lot of alpha to our investors. And so it's holistic in that I think it has to start at the asset owner level. The people that are advocating for this necessarily have to live it and breathe it and believe it and do it. And I think that's kind of the moment that we're living in. But on the other side, I mean, Jim, you can't pick up the paper, and I live in Texas, right? So we're in a place where this is being massively pushed back against, and probably rightfully so, that race is not necessarily the right sort of lens for this type of work. It's really more about opportunity and access. And so it's like, give people a chance, right? Let's get them at the table so they can compete I mean, I don't want a handout. No one wants that. We want more of a fair playing field, and then let's go from there. I think given what I find inspiring about the data and the research is that the outcomes are great. It's not like there's going to be this moment where, you know, we make all this noise and push all these people to the forefront and they fail. I think they're going to do incredibly well. So yeah. I know that's a rambling answer, but I think it is an opportunity. On the other hand, there is so much push out coming right now. This is certainly coming at a time where it is much more difficult to have asset owners and the people that are in power here do something about it. And so the numbers have to speak for themselves. And so, you know, this research is incredibly important.
Sometimes we don't qualify for emerging managers program, right? We're disqualified in some cases. And but they don't. Why is it that? I mean, if numbers really matter, why isn't Asian American owned firms doing much better in the marketplace?
Yeah. We have to advocate for ourselves, Jim. It really comes down to that sort of fact that this is competitive, that there's an opportunity, but it's not going to change until we are included in every one of those DEI searches, right? It's because it's absolutely it's factual. It's not. There's no reality here that you can get from the numbers, and that's why this research is so important. But on the other hand, it's like I think as we find partners within the ecosystem that are actually helping, right? Identify those that are leaning our direction, that understand the opportunity and the positive aspects to capital growth from doing this. Let's find those partners. Let's make sure that they are celebrated and that people understand who they are, and create, you know, much more I think momentum in that direction. This is always a momentum game. It's small little wins that keeps going, right? And so finding those that are actually going from speeches to making those reaches, celebrating them, working with them, advocating in that direction, I think will be good. But it really has to be a very, I think, more aggressive top-down sort of moment from here. And I think I'm very, I think one of the things that Alex, that I loved about your research piece was that it wasn't just, you know, looking at all the negatives. There was a very constructive, positive tone to the paper, and I think that's exactly what I would expect from you know, this situation, because I think that's who we are. I think how we carry ourselves within the industry will go a long way to helping us grow.
I think advocacy is something that we can learn from other diverse communities. They've been doing it longer. They've been much more effective. If you look at the U.S. Congress right now, you know, we represent a little over 6-7% of the U.S. population. I think if you look at the number of Asian American, Pacific Islander elected officials in Congress, it's like 4.5 or something like that. Pretty low. It's never really. Although this year you've seen a lot more people jumping into the races and all that, which is nice to see that we're out there doing it. But we're also not good at supporting fundraisers. Like, we don't give money to politicians like other communities do. And so there's a lot of things that we have to sort of look in our own mirror, like, and figure this one out too. But I also think it's an interesting dynamic, right? Sometimes we're sitting on 0.3% AUM and people treat us like we're controlling 30% AUM, right? And I wish we did, but we don't. And despite the performance and all that kind of stuff, but we also sometimes get lumped in with these, you know, you got these diverse programs, diverse DEI programs, emerging managers programs, which are still a small drop in the bucket.
Right.
You know, if you look at the actual dollar amount as a percentage, it's very small. And so unfortunately, it puts everyone in this kind of pitting against each other. You know, you're trying to chase after a small sum of money. And we have to, I think, as a community, not only AAPI, but all diverse communities, we have to push for higher numbers for everyone. Because it's otherwise, all we're going to do is just trying to take a couple of you know, extra AUMs from one to move it to another. Right. It's not advancing the broader cause. as a community, as a broader set of community. And so I think that's part of the, I think, the work that Bella has done to kind of enlighten the industry as a whole about that. And it's really kind of shook things up a bit. Now, awareness and actual making things happen is so different, right? It's hard to, you have incumbents that have had managing lots of capital, and it's very hard to move those things around, and it takes some time, but we have to push that, as a community overall. Alex, if you were to kind of think about, like, what other things can the industry be doing in terms of, I know you're focused on data and research, some additional data and research that would be needed to really try to drive some change, what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's more that could be done in terms of looking at, for instance, if you think about the progression analysis, not just representation at each level, but almost what it takes to move up the ladder, whether there are differences in terms of the backgrounds or even just tenure it takes to become a managing director or a partner or whatever it may be for different groups. I also think that sort of feeds into another idea, though, of providing resources to these aspiring managers, whether in the form of training or support or some of the work like AIM is doing. I think is really important too. We've seen, if you look at just first-time fundraising numbers, I think the percentage of successful first-time managers is something like 10% last year compared to maybe 20% a decade ago. And so as the industry is just inherently becoming more competitive, everything's moving more quickly, to the extent that additional resources can be provided to those managers who might be sort of on the cusp of tier 3 moving to tier 4, or whatever it might take to sort of kick them up to the next level, I think is something that more generally would be helpful, and I think might help move the needle a little bit beyond just looking at kind of counts and percentages at different levels of seniority.
I mean, that kind of number also makes a lot of allocators nervous, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna invest in a new fund manager. I'm not sure if they're gonna be around. Now, Mark, you've had a very successful run in the past. So they go, okay, he has a track record, and so you start a new fund, right? And you've been able to raise good amount of capital and all of that. But like, what would you suggest to a kind of a newly minted emerging manager? Would that the kind of background and qualifications that you might have, right? What would you suggest to them?
Good luck.
Well, something better than good luck.
Again, I think the opportunity here is to create an ecosystem that advocates for itself, right? So I am much more likely to entertain a conversation with, all things being equal, someone of AAPI, and because I see the need, right? I see the need to create more diversity and more opportunity. And so I'm looking for that as I build my firm. And then as we create success and are fortunate to have success, right? What do we do with that? The funding research like this is critical. Working with the amazing people at AIM in what you're doing, in helping build the pipeline and have research and conferences, stuff like that. That's critical, right? So you got to lean in and do it. I would say that this ecosystem that is evolving. I mean, AIM is coming a long way from where they were under your leadership, Jim, and I applaud you for that. The momentum is building, and I think what I would tell newly minted managers is the industry is so competitive that everybody's good. The relationships that you build over time are incredibly powerful in those moments. And so as emerging managers develop those relationships, I think it's just a matter of time, and those will come. But as we build this network, right, as the API community grows and understands the idea that we have to advocate for ourselves, right? Certainly, you're right. We need to partner with other people in the system, but we've done. It's like, where are we going to? We're going to shift from from helping everyone to helping ourselves, I would say this is the moment to help ourselves in a lot of ways. And so as that groundswell happens, I think there will be more and more opportunities. I'm always looking for good people. I know that if 10% of the senior people, as Alex has told us in this industry, are AAPIs, and we can get representation and advocacy from that group, that will be powerful.
Your point about relationships, building a support network. And if you think about why AIM exists, it's an ecosystem of diverse managers, but individuals in the business that want to connect, support as a community, API community, as you know, Mark, and we've all come at different places and time, immigrated, come to this country in lots of different ways, lots of different history back home between each other. And sometimes we don't do a good job of supporting each other, and like things like what's happened with the Asian hate, the emergence of sort of the notion that no matter how wealthy, how well-to-do you get, you can't run from how you look. And these things are, just right in front of you. So we have to kind of figure out ways to support each other better. And I look at this one data that I've seen, which is Asian Americans are the least likely in a company to have a mentor and have a sponsor, right? We're least likely to have a mentor and a sponsor. And as you know, that is one of the keys to moving up in corporate America, investment firms and what have you. But the flip side of it is that the Asian Americans are also least likely to mentor and sponsor other Asian Americans. And so what that tells me is we have to do a better job ourselves.
Yeah.
We have to take care of people. When we make it, we have to help people up as a community. And we got to do a better job of that overall. And but we also have to remember that these relationships are so critical to how you move up in your career. We think it's always about the work. And as you know, that's not the case. A lot of those other people that are moving past you in your career, it's not because they're smarter, they didn't work harder. They built these other connections and that helped them move up. And I think your point around that is super important. And I think hopefully the folks that were on this program and listening in on this could take that away, which is that, take control of your own destiny around that, build those relationships, but also take care of our community when you make it, take care of each other, right? And so
and if there are senior people on this call right now on this thing, I would challenge, I would ask each of you to number one, are you mentoring someone? Is that an active part of what you're doing? And if not, do it. I think to your point, that would be powerful.
We look forward to a great 24. So this is our last program of the year. So thank you both for being on it. And thank you for all of you who signed up for this, joining us right before the holidays. So take care, be well, and take care of each other.